March 28th, 193 AD. Before dawn breaks over the Palatine Hill, a mob of armed men moves through marble corridors meant for emperors, not soldiers. Their boots echo against floors polished by centuries of imperial ceremony. They are the Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to protect the ruler of the known world. And tonight they have come to kill him. Inside his private chambers, an old man rises to meet them. He does not run. He does not beg. Pertinax, 66 years old, a son of a freed slave who clawed his way to the summit of the most powerful empire on earth, stands in his nightclothes and tries, one last time, to reason with men who have already stopped listening. A spear finds him before his sentence is finished. His head is severed from his shoulders and lifted onto the point of a lance, carried out into the streets of Rome like a hunting trophy, paraded past bakeries and temples and the terrified faces of citizens who understand, in an instant, that something fundamental is broken. The Roman Empire has just discovered that it has no emperor, and within hours it will discover something far worse, that the throne of Caesar Augustus, of Trajan, of Marcus Aurelius, is now for sale. To understand how Rome arrived at the edge of this abyss, one has to understand what had already been lost. For over 80 years, historians would later call the age that preceded this one the reign of the 5 good emperors, a rare and fragile stretch when competence, not violence, decided who wore the purple. That era ended with Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king who spent his final years fighting wars he never wanted, and it died completely with his son, Commodus, whose obsession with gladiatorial spectacle and paranoid purges had already begun, bleeding the treasury and terrorizing the Senate. When Commodus was finally strangled in his bath in 192 AD by his own wrestling partner, Rome exhaled briefly. The conspirators needed a legitimate face to install, and they found one in Pertinax, a respected senator and former general known for personal discipline and old-fashioned virtue. It seemed, for a moment, that Rome might repair itself. But Pertinax made a fatal miscalculation. He believed that the empire could be run as it once had been, with restraint, with fiscal responsibility, with respect for law, rather than fear. He tried to cut the bloated privileges of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who had grown accustomed to enormous bonuses and unchecked power under Commodus's negligent rule. He tried to restore the authority of the Senate. He tried, in short, to behave like an emperor should, and in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. The Guard had tasted what it meant to make and unmake emperors. They were not going to relinquish that taste for a reformer's austerity. 87 days after taking the throne, Pertinax was dead, and Rome had a vacancy at its absolute center, and a Praetorian Guard that had just proven, in the bloodiest terms possible, exactly who held the real power in the capital of the world. What happened next has no true parallel in the history of empires. With Pertinax's blood barely dry on the palace floor, the Praetorian Guard did not simply select a replacement. They realized, with cold and terrible clarity, that they now possessed something of almost unimaginable value, the throne itself, and so they decided to sell it. The Guard mounted the ramparts of their fortified camp on the outskirts of Rome and announced, to whoever would listen, that the imperial title would go to whoever paid them the most money, not through conquest, not through senatorial approval, through cash counted out per soldier, delivered on the spot. 2 men answered the call. The first was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's own father-in-law, a respected figure who arrived at the walls of the Praetorian camp, hoping his connection to the murdered emperor might carry weight. The second was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator with a reputation for personal excess, who had reportedly been drinking at a banquet when news of the vacancy reached him. He did not hesitate. He rushed to the camp, and when he found the gates barred to outsiders and Sulpicianus already inside negotiating, he stood beneath the walls and began shouting his bids upward to the soldiers looking down from the ramparts. What followed was one of the most grotesque scenes in Roman history. The fate of an empire of 60 million people, decided not in the Senate, not on a battlefield, but in a shouting match between 2 rich men standing outside a barracks wall, while soldiers leaned over the fortifications like auctioneers at a slave market, calling down each new number to be topped. Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sesterces per soldier. Julianus, desperate not to lose, raised it. Sulpicianus raised again. Back and forth the numbers climbed, each round escalating the absurdity, until Julianus finally shouted an offer of 25,000 sesterces to every single Praetorian guardsman, a staggering sum that, multiplied across the thousands of men in the Guard, may have totaled well over 200 million sesterces. It was, by any measure, one of the largest single financial transactions in the ancient world, spent not on land, not on conquest, not on infrastructure, but on the naked purchase of legitimacy itself. The soldiers, unmoved by any sense of duty to the state they served, opened the gates for the higher bidder. Didius Julianus was declared Emperor of Rome before the sun had set. On the same day, Sulpicianus believed he was close to victory. There was no coronation befitting the moment. There was no procession of senators offering blessing. Julianus was marched into the city center under armed guard. because the Praetorians understood, even as they collected their payment, that the citizens of Rome would not accept this transaction quietly. The streets were filled not with cheering crowds, but with jeering ones. Citizens hurled insults, and some accounts describe stones thrown at the new emperor's procession. Rome had seen bad emperors before: madmen, tyrants, murderers. But it had never seen its own throne treated so openly as a commercial good, and the psychological wound this inflicted on the city's sense of itself cannot be overstated. An empire that told itself a story of destiny, of divine mandate, of unbroken continuity from the days of Augustus, had just watched its highest office go to whoever could produce the largest sack of coin fastest, the purchase. However, bought Julianus nothing resembling actual power. Legitimacy cannot be minted. Word of the auction spread through the empire's provinces within weeks, carried by merchants, soldiers, and couriers along the same roads that had once carried news of Rome's glories. And, in 3 separate corners of the empire, 3 separate legionary commanders reached an identical, furious conclusion. If the throne could simply be bought by a rich civilian in Rome, then it could just as easily be taken by a general with actual armies at his back. Pescennius Niger declared himself emperor in Syria. Clodius Albinus did the same in Britain, and in Pannonia, a hardened, ruthless commander named Septimius Severus began marching his legions toward Italy with a speed and discipline that made clear he had no intention of losing. Julianus, trapped in a palace he had purchased but could not defend, attempted increasingly desperate measures. He tried to have Severus declared a public enemy. He tried, humiliatingly, to bribe Severus to abandon his march, offering to share the throne, an offer that was ignored entirely. He even attempted to organize Rome's own defenses, ordering elephants brought into the city in a bizarre effort to intimidate the approaching legions, a plan that dissolved into chaos as the animals proved impossible to control, and the soldiers assigned to guard. The city showed no appetite for dying on behalf of a man they had only weeks earlier been paid to install. The Senate, sensing which way the wind was blowing and eager to distance itself from the shame of the auction, abandoned Julianus entirely. They declared him an enemy of the state and, in an act of pure political survival, condemned to death the very man they had allowed to buy his way to power. On June 1st, 193 AD, after a reign of only 66 days, one of the shortest in the entire history of the Roman Empire, a soldier was sent into the palace to execute him. Accounts describe Julianus begging for his life in his final moments, asking what crime he had committed beyond wanting to live. He was beheaded where he stood, and his head was carried away as proof of the deed, in grim mirror image of what had been done to Pertinax barely 2 months before. Septimius Severus entered Rome shortly after, and his first act as the empire's new master was chillingly precise. He did not forgive the Praetorian Guard for their auction. He surrounded their camp with his own loyal legions, stripped the guard of its weapons and privileges, executed the ringleaders of Pertinax's murder, and dissolved the very unit that had turned Rome's throne into a marketplace. In doing so, Severus made unmistakably clear where power in the empire would reside from that point forward, not with the Senate's ancient authority, not with civilian wealth, but with whichever man controlled the largest and most loyal army. His deathbed advice to his own sons, delivered years later, would summarize the lesson of this entire catastrophe with brutal honesty: enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. What makes the story of 193 AD so quietly devastating is not its violence. Rome had already seen far bloodier years, but its exposure of a fiction. For centuries, the empire had convinced itself that its throne represented something sacred, something earned, something that could not simply be handed over to the man with the deepest pockets. The year of the 5 emperors tore that fiction apart in the span of a single afternoon outside a barracks wall, replacing it with an uglier and more honest truth: that the most powerful office on earth had become, in practice, an object to be sold, seized, or stolen by whoever held the necessary force or funds. Didius Julianus is remembered today not as a monster like Caligula or Nero, not as a fool who craved cruelty for its own sake, but as something arguably sadder: a wealthy man who mistook a barracks transaction for a coronation, who believed that money could purchase what only loyalty, competence, or the sword could actually secure. He paid a fortune for 66 days, a jeering procession through hostile streets, and an executioner's blade waiting for him in the palace he thought he had bought outright. The empire, for its part, survived the humiliation as empires generally do. But something had shifted permanently in how power would be understood and pursued in Rome from that point forward. The auctioning of the throne was not an isolated embarrassment. It was a preview of the chaos that would define the century to come. A century in which emperors would rise and fall with dizzying speed, propped up or torn down not by senates or citizens, but by the private calculations of soldiers who had learned, once and for all, exactly what their loyalty was worth.